Welcome everyone to, I guess this is the inaugural book club for the Global Dialogues. The sponsor for tonight's event is the Institute for Regional and International Studies National Resource Center, IRS-NRC, supports and enhances global awareness, and inspires informed thinking about the complexities of the world. It provides resources and expertise to K-12 and post-secondary educators, students, and the community at large. Special thanks to the co-sponsors, Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, where I'm Associate Dean, and the Wisconsin Law School, where I'm faculty member, the Environmental Law Society at the University of Wisconsin Law School, and the Geography Department at UW-Madison. We invite you to visit their websites and follow them on social media. Essie is here to provide tech support. If you have any challenges, use the chat function to contact her. We'll be recording tonight's event and sharing the link in a post-event email. We'll only show the recording. You'll only show it on the recording if your microphone is turned on to speak. Otherwise, you won't be accidentally in there. Please enter any questions in the chat for the Q&A portion during the last 15 minutes of the event, or you can raise your hand and we can spot you in Zoom land. Our land acknowledgement statement. The UW-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation called Dejope, since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both of the federal and state governments repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. Its history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. I am delighted to be able to introduce my friend and colleague, James Salzman, to speak to us tonight on the future, past and future of safe drinking water. Jim is the Donald Bren Distinguished Professor of Environmental Law with joint appointments at the UCLA School of Law and the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara. He's done so many things. He's written 12 books, authored more than 100 articles and book chapters, and his broad-ranging scholarship has addressed topics spanning drinking water, policy instrument design, and creating markets for ecosystem services. I am honored to use his casebook in two of my classes, environmental law and natural resources law, and I'm really excited to hear him speak tonight. So without further ado, welcome, Jim.
Great, thanks so much, Steph, and thank you all for spending your Wednesday afternoons with me. Seeing all these thumbnails on Zoom brings back memories of teaching during 2021. Unlike then, I'm actually wearing real pants instead of pajama bottoms. So I'm coming to you from the Boston Public Library. So hopefully no one's going to come over and shush me. But so far, so good. And so what I'm going to talk with you about today is a book that I wrote in 2012 and then second edition in 2016. And it's on what I think is one of the single most interesting topics that there is out there, and that's drinking water. And so what I thought might be helpful is to talk a little bit about where did the book come from, and then to basically tell a few stories from the book, and then leave a lot of time basically for discussion, for Q&A, because if there's one topic that everyone has a view on, it's drinking water. So where did the book come from? So as Steph said, I've written a lot of case books. And case books are great, but they're also a little frustrating because case books basically have a very small audience. The only audience I really care about with a case book is the professors who assign it, because the students have to buy the case book. And so for a long time, I wanted to write a popular book. I call this my airport book. When you were stuck in the airport and your flight is delayed out of Milwaukee or O'Hare or something, instead of buying some junk like Freakonomics, instead you'd pick up my book, Drinking Water: A History, start flipping through it and actually purchase it, and better yet, purchase it for your friends because the holidays are soon approaching. But where did I get the idea for the book? So I wanted to write a popular book, and I was teaching a class in the Clean Water Act about 2004, 2005, and I was riffing about how remarkable it is, how extraordinary it is that we get from our tap water today in the United States. We have access to, more people have access to safe drinking water than ever before in human history, right? That's an amazing accomplishment. And as I said that, I looked around the room and most of the students had bottles of water purchase bottles of water sitting in front of them. And I thought, well, that's weird. I mean, if drinking water from the tap is safe, what do they think they're buying? And I was a big fan of books by Mark Kurlansky. He wrote Cod, he wrote Salt. And it turns out there's actually a whole genre of books that give the history of the world through the prism of a commodity. So there are ones about vanilla, rum, slavery basically is commodification of people. I mean, there's a whole litany of books out there. So I ran to my bookstore and I realized that no one had written a book about drinking water as a discrete commodity. There were a lot of books about bottled water. There were a lot of books about water, but no one really had talked about just drinking water. And so I said, all right, that's what I'm going to do. And it turns out that I basically, there's 6 chapters getting on the sort of 6 glasses of drinking water, which is a myth, which I can tell you about as well if you're interested where that came from. But it basically kind of follows the life cycle of drinking water. The first chapter talks about myth in drinking water, and it's remarkable how many religions have some aspect of drinking water as a core part of their theology. So, you know, the oldest sort of religious mythological story we have is from ancient Babylonia, where sort of drinking water is essential to that story. You think about Christianity, living water. It's an important part of a lot of different theologies. And the sort of 3 things I want to talk about that are part of this the story is who gets to drink, how do you know the water is safe to drink, and Flint. So let me talk a little bit about who gets to drink. So one of the things that I find most fascinating, I was a history major in college, and one of the things I find most fascinating about drinking water is the challenges that we face now in 21st century America are pretty much identical to the challenges that ancient civilizations faced. I mean, one thing that I think is really cool is that we've got to find a source of safe drinking water. We've got to find a way to transport it so it doesn't get contaminated. We've got to find a way for people to get access to the water from where it is so it doesn't get contaminated. And that's no different than Babylonia or Assyria. And you know, we have different ways of doing it, but not that different. And so one of the interesting aspects of who gets to drink is that oftentimes drinking water is not plentiful. And then how do you decide who gets to drink? And so nowadays, there are all these debates about privatization and such. And so what I wondered is, to what extent is drinking water basically a right? We should have access to drinking water because it's a human right. And to what extent should we have access to drinking water mediated by markets? And there's a huge divide about the nature of drinking water. And so I thought, well, what is if we go back in history, how was drinking water thought of? And so I thought, okay, I need to find a place where I have accessible rules of a civilization that wrote those rules down and lived in an arid place. And it turns out the Old Testament is a pretty good place to look for that. And once you start looking into it, it turns out that the wandering Jews, the ancient Jewish civilization had a lot of rules for drinking water. And the rule basically was that you were not allowed to sell drinking water because it was in fact, you couldn't exclude, it was seen as a gift from God. It would be like, I don't know, putting the 10 Commandments on eBay or something like that. Basically, it'd be sacrilegious. But there's an exception. If you put in physical labor to access the water, then you have a right to exclude. And this basically is if you dig a well. So think back, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia. There's a classic scene where Peter O'Toole is dying of thirst in the desert. He and his guide find this well. They start drinking from it. Omar Sharif emerges from the shimmering heat and shoots and kills his guide. And he says he's from a dirty tribe. That might have made sense if the rules simply were you can exclude, but there was an exception to that called the right of thirst. And the right of thirst basically said that if someone from outside your community is in desperate need of the water, they get priority over all your other uses apart from drinking. And this is what legal scholars call a Rawlsian rule, R-A-W-L. So this guy, John Rawls, he had this way of thinking about what would be the perfectly just society. And he said, we can figure that out if the ruler operates behind a veil of ignorance. So imagine for a moment that you're the ruler and you're trying to make the rules for the society. And once you take off the veil, you don't know who you're going to be. rich, poor, white, black, male, female, you name it. And the idea behind the sort of Rawlsian veil of ignorance is you're going to end up with rules that protect the most vulnerable. The rule of thirst is a perfect Rawlsian rule because you don't know if you may one day become that person who's dying of thirst. Right? So the rule is basically perfectly set up for that situation. And if you look at the Quran, the exact same rule is in the Quran as well. And you find it in ancient Hindu rules as well. So, if we go back to sort of biblical times, water was not a commodity, it was a right. So where do you find when it starts to be sold? And the place you look for that is actually a place where I think you find everything drinking water, and that's ancient Rome. The Romans were masters of water. I mean, it's quite remarkable. I'm sure many of you have traveled, and you see these aqueducts that still are standing 2,000 years later. And not only do they have structural integrity, but they're beautiful. I mean, the engineering is incredible that they're able to do this. So why did they bring the water into Rome and some other places as well? It was not for drinking water originally. It turns out that originally was for waste management. The Romans had this great insight of sewers. And the way you keep a clean city is you flush out the waste. And so the water was brought in initially for the sewer system. It was called the Cloaca Maxima, this giant sewer system that ran through Rome. The second use wasn't drinking water either. The second use was social. Baths were a very important of the Roman social life. Only about 400 years after the aqueducts came in did you start to get water brought in for drinking. And at this point, the story takes an interesting twist because you were able to get, there was a special aqueduct that brought it in, and about half of that water went to private use, went to private residences. And we know this because there was a guy called Frontinus who was a Roman engineer. And through amazing happenstance, his books sort of made it through the monasteries and such to modern day. It would be as if 1,000 years from now, Home Depot's do-it-yourself guide somehow survived. We knew a lot about how to fix a toilet back in 21st century America. So Frontinus is complaining about this thing called the vectigal. So the vectigal is a fee that you paid in order to get water into your home. Now, Roman water, there were no faucets. Water was free flowing. So any thoughts about how they charged people with the vectigal? We've got the chat going. Any ideas for how the vectigal was charged? It's not for how much you turn off. Well, I'll jump to it because I want to get through some stories. It was the diameter of the pipe. Larger diameter, the more you pay. Smaller diameter, the less you pay. And we know this was a big deal because Frontinus complains about something he called puncturing. So puncturing happened when basically in the dead of night, these folks, probably not folks, probably their slaves, would go out and lift up the flagstones and puncture the water mains and surreptitiously bring the water into their house. So one of the questions is, how could they puncture the water mains? Because you certainly couldn't puncture water mains today. Well, does anyone know what the Latin word for the Latin word for lead is? Oh, no chats. Maybe chat's not working. Anyway, the Latin word for lead is plumbum, and that's where we get plumbing from, plumber. So you basically just punctured the soft metal and brought it in. So the Romans basically have drinking water as a right because a lot of people got their water from the so-called lacus. It was a white marble basin you find all over the place. You find in Vesuvius, Herculaneum, they survived. So the whether water was a right or was a commodity depended on how you accessed it. The last part of the story, and then I'll jump to another story, and then I'll stop. Is the question of when has it become a pure commodity. And the best story for that is where everything is for sale, which is New York. So you all know the story of selling Manhattan Island. So when the Dutch came to Manhattan, to Manhattan Island, they basically had very shallow wells. It basically was a trading colony. They didn't do a lot about it. They built a fort, but there were no wells inside the fort. So when the British came up the Hudson, the Dutch go into their fort, they close the gate, then they suddenly think, oh my gosh, we've got no water. So they basically surrender after a day. The British come in, they rename it from New Amsterdam to New York. They dig some wells, but not a lot. And basically, it's becoming a bigger and bigger city. And the drinking water becomes very bad. There's a travelogue that's written by a Swedish writer in the 1750s. And he's got this line that Rodney Dangerfield would be proud of. He says, the drinking water in New York is so bad, the horses from out of town refuse to drink it. And so basically, there's a big problem. What are we going to do? And the city council basically starts issuing money. It's the first money issued by a city in the New World. And it's called waterworks money. They take the money, they start building basically aqueducts all over the city. They're going to have these sort of pretty primitive steam pumps. They start to build them, and New York is the first city that the British invade in the Revolutionary War. They destroy the waterworks. And then nothing happens for the next 30 years. And so Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, they all put in public waterworks. New York doesn't do anything until you get a very strange event. So you've all seen the movie Hamilton or know about it. So there's a chapter in that story that's not in the musical. So basically, Aaron Burr teamed up with Alexander Hamilton, and they formed a company called the Manhattan Company. And Burr went to Albany, and he convinced the assembly to give the company monopoly on the distribution of pure and wholesome drinking water. And so Burr was a scoundrel. That part of the musical is accurate. And he had no intention of actually providing pure and wholesome drinking water. He just kept providing the crummy water that was there. He basically was allowed to raise $2 million, and he basically put it out, he lent it out. He basically wanted to operate as a bank without the strictures of a bank charter. And so this is basically what happens over time. Finally, it's not working. The city brings in its own public drinking water, but the Manhattan Company continues to exist, and it becomes the Chase Manhattan Bank, and it becomes the Chase Bank. This is a true story. The Chase Manhattan Bank continued to pump drinking water into the 1920s because they were afraid they would lose their corporate charter. If you don't believe me, look at the logo for the Chase Manhattan Bank, and it is a cross section of a wooden water pipe. It's a true story. Most of what I said before I made up, but this actually is totally true. So let me just leave that for a moment. There's more I can talk about. Let me talk very briefly about the question of, is the water safe to drink? Because I think there's going to be a lot of questions about this. Conceptually, this was the hardest part of the book to write, because imagine for a moment we got into a time capsule and we went back to Victorian England, 1820s, 1830s, and they said, welcome, you must be really thirsty, have a glass to drink. Right? And Steph, because she's a very polite person, would say, oh no, I really couldn't. No, I really don't want to drink this. Right? And why would she not want to drink it? Because she would think that's unsafe. They would look at her and say, what are you talking about? This water is perfectly safe to drink. We think our water today is safe to drink. 50 years from now, they may look back and say, what were you thinking? And so one of the questions was, what is it about each era that makes them think their water is safe to drink? And I think the answer is etiology, is our idea of disease. Where does disease come from? So really, up until about the 19th century, the dominant theory of disease was what was known as disease airs, right? So if you look at like malaria, if you actually define malaria literally means bad air. And the idea was you get sick from breathing contaminated air. So you look at these pictures of folks during the plague, and they had these weird masks with these long noses and stuff. They were trying to purify the air that they were breathing. Now, it's not totally wrong, right? If there's really bad air, it probably is something that's contaminated. But the idea that diseases were waterborne was seen as crazy, right? Totally crazy. And so the story of how that comes to pass basically is a story about water, a guy called John Snow, who basically realized that cholera was a waterborne disease. And I can tell the story a bit later. But essentially, it's the origin of public health. He's the first person who uses mapping to try to figure out how disease is caused. Let me just mention one last thing, and then I'll stop, and we can sort of get into specific questions. And that is Flint. So I published my book in 2012, and it was, it did fine. It was a popular book. And then Flint happened 2015, 2016. And it's the single most important event in the history of US drinking water. If you look at a lot of our major environmental laws, you can connect them with single historic events. Clean Water Act is the Cuyahoga River burning. Superfund is Love Canal. And Safe Drinking Water Act now is Flint, right? And Flint basically is a very disturbing story because there was sort of triple governmental failure. The Safe Drinking Water Act was designed to have a fail-safe. The Locals are supposed to follow the rules. The state looks over the local shoulder. The EPA looks over the state's shoulder. And every single level of that failed. And I can go into more detail if you want about sort of how that happened. But I do a lot of speaking about drinking water. And a question I always get is how many Flints are out there? And the answer is we don't really know. And there's an environmental justice story there as well. But let me stop here. I mean, I could go on, and I have gone on for hours. But I want to hear what particular topics folks are interested in asking about as well. So if there aren't questions, I keep going on and tell some of these stories in more detail. But I'm happy at this point just to stop for a sec and hear what interests you.
Yeah, feel free to raise your hands or type your questions into the chat while we're waiting for questions from the audience. I said earlier that I was going to ask you about PFAS, but I'm going to hold off on that because something you said reminded me of something that happened during the pandemic, which was all the water shutoffs in Detroit and in a bunch of other cities. But Detroit
Yeah.
was one of the most visible. And there, the struggles about the rhetoric was more about human right to water, right?
Yeah.
And they even brought in like UN special rapporteur or something to tour Detroit. So that's just what came to me, and I was wondering if you had any reflections on the water shutoffs.
Yeah, for sure. And this is an issue that really has become a much bigger issue in the last decade. And so, the question is, first of all, what would a human right to water look like? Where does it come from? And then what would it mean in practice? And so you've got this real sort of split, as I said earlier, those who view drinking water as fundamentally a commodity that should be subject to market forces, and those think, no, it's a human right. So let me give the market force argument first, because it's not a crazy argument. So the argument basically is twofold. The first is that drinking water is underpriced. And because it's a vital commodity, if it's underpriced, people will overuse it. And so you need sort of the discipline of pricing to get people to use drinking water efficiently and effectively, so it's not wasted. That frankly makes more sense in an agricultural setting when huge quantities of water are being used than in domestic, but that's sort of one argument. The second argument is, and I can sort of paraphrase the head of Veolia, which is one of the major global water firms. And he said, God may have given us drinking water, but God forgot to lay the pipes. And the basic argument he's making is that whether water is a human right or not isn't really the question. The question is, do you have a right to get water brought to you? Right? In other words, when you talk water, the name of the game of water is infrastructure. Right? It's very hard to move water. It's expensive to move water. And so the key question that comes up, asking is there a human right to water, kind of misses it misses the point a bit. And what's really asking is who should pay for the infrastructure to get safe drinking water to consumers. And so the argument basically goes, look, drinking water is a commodity. We don't have a right to food, a human right to food. Maybe we should, but we don't think about food that way. Why should we think about drinking water that way? So what happened in Detroit basically is that there were a lot of folks who were behind on their bills, and the utility just shut them off, right? Because they basically say, look, we have to pay our bills. We're a company, right? And we have to maintain our infrastructure. If people don't pay, what do you want us to do? We're not a charity. Now, what makes the Detroit story particularly painful is there were some very large corporate users that also were in arrears, like Ford Stadium,
Mhm.
and they didn't cut them off. And so there's a real concern about double standards going on in this case. There are some very interesting ways that the human right to water has been addressed. And so one I think that's the most interesting is basically this notion of step pricing. And so in a number of countries in Europe, drinking water is essentially at a certain amount is virtually free. But once you use a certain amount, then the level goes up, the tariff goes up considerably. And so the idea is we should provide a minimum amount effectively for free. But then after a certain amount, the block pricing goes up. And that makes good sense to me. You have a number of cities in India where are these basically water kiosks. And you can put in a coin, a special kind of coin that's very cheap, and it gives you a certain amount of water, but not a lot, right? We don't operate that way in the US. Arguably, we should. But one of the difficulties is who's going to pay for the infrastructure. And so I think that's the question. To say there should be human right to water is an idealistic thing to say. And I think in principle, I think everyone agrees with it, but it doesn't address the problem of how do you pay for infrastructure. And the particular difficulty, this gets into private-public debate. A lot of people say privatization is a terrible idea. Public is not so great either, in the sense that with a few exceptions, most public utilities are woefully underfunded because the commissioners who basically run to be elected to be on the water board promise no rate increases. And that's a problem because our water infrastructure, the American Society of Engineers gives our water infrastructure a D. Nationally, a water main is bursting every 2 minutes somewhere in the country. In DC, Steph, I know you lived there for a while, a water main bursts every day
Yeah.
in DC. A lot of these water mains are 50, 60 years old. And so there's a reckoning that's coming. And the question is, how are we going to pay for it?
Thank you. Thank you. We have one hand that's raised and a few questions in the chat. I'll take the hand that's raised first, and then I'll read through some questions in the chat. So,
Sure.
Alex Hines.
Hi, thank you so much for this fascinating series of examples and reflections. I think given your answer to Steph's question, I know partly your answer to what I wanted to hear your reflections on, which is about one solution that has been proposed and tried, and it was tried in 2020, I believe, in Lake Erie, was to give rights to Lake Erie.
Libor, I love this question.
Libor, yeah, and that was a drinking water issue. A lot of the other nature rights stuff hasn't been about drinking water, but that one was. So I'm just wondering, I mean, again, it's rights, it's very idealistic and not, it doesn't tell us really who's going to pay for what, but I'd be interested in hearing what you think.
Yeah, I love this question because, Steph, I don't know if you know this, I'm actually teaching I visited Harvard every fall. And I'm teaching a course, a water law course, and I'm also teaching a new course with Jill Lepore, the historian, called Rights of Nature.
Oh, wow.
And we actually taught the Libor case in the very first class. For those of you who don't know the story. So Toledo, big city on Lake Erie, they have terrible problems with eutrophication and basically these algal blooms. And in 2014, they had this alert that was not only a, boil, do not drink alert, it was do not allow the water to come into contact with your skin alert, which is about as bad as you can get. And there was enormous frustration. And the frustration was not the Safe Drinking Water Act. Morgan Robertson has asked a question that's related, so I'm gonna loop that in. The problem was that the Clean Water Act basically doesn't address what's called non-point source pollution. It's basically runoff from farms. And so you had this huge nutrient runoff that would go into Lake Erie and these enormous algal blooms, and you get these toxins that would sometimes be produced. And the state just wasn't, the state has authority to actually do this. The Clean Water Act doesn't, the feds don't, but the state could, and they weren't. And so essentially what happened is the locals just got fed up, and they passed an initiative called the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. And it's, as a lawyer, it's a fascinating document. There are just a few of the things it does. So it basically says that Lake Erie has legal personhood and has the right to flourish and to exist in an unpolluted state. It gives citizens the right to sue on behalf of Lake Erie, to sue corporations on behalf of Lake Erie. It says that corporations do not have legal personhood under this law and therefore cannot defend themselves in court. And it says that any state law that is contradictory to this particular ordinance shall not be given effect. Now, you don't have to be a law student. You don't even have to be able to spell law to know that there are big constitutional problems with all of those. And in fact, a court struck it down. What a quote from the decision was, this is a textbook example of what local government cannot do. And so you look at this and you think, what's going on here? I mean, these were sophisticated lawyers who wrote this ordinance. They knew that it wasn't going to be upheld. So here's the game. What happened was, just a month before the decision came down, Mike DeWine, who was the governor of Ohio, he announced an initiative called H2 Ohio, which was a major funding operation to address non-point source pollution. And the very first place the funding went was the watershed of Toledo. And so the rights of nature approach here was focusing not in the court of law, where they surely would lose and did lose, but in the court of public opinion. And so, it's one of those things where you realize that law plays out in a lot of different ways. I don't know if that sort of gets at your question or not.
Yeah, and I think that also was what happened in Detroit too. A lot of the rights to water was used to, or provide the political motivation for the moratorium on water shutdowns. Let me, Morgan has his hand up, but I'm gonna read some questions from the chat since they came in earlier. Um, Let's see. One question is, what would you say the individual need to drinking water got would you say the individual need for drinking water got to a place of a bigger social problem, especially in the future with more privatization of water sources? And then the other question, next question is, what country or group of countries has the best quality drinking water? And which one?
Well, the US is some of the best drinking water, actually. I mean, we tend to focus on Flint and on Jackson, Mississippi, and we should. Those are real problems. But if you look nationally at the actual drinking water reports, it's quite extraordinary. Water utilities get a bad rap. And part of it, frankly, is because of ad campaigns of bottled water companies. There was an ad campaign by Fiji Water that's billboard, and it said it's called Fiji Water because it's not from Cleveland, which I thought was kind of a real kind of low blow
Yeah.
um, to Cleveland. And so Cleveland, though, they have a sense of humor. They actually sponsored, Morgan probably knows about this, they sponsored a study where they actually looked at the quality of bottled waters and compared it to Cleveland tap water. And Cleveland tap water actually was a lot cleaner than the bottled waters, because bottled water is regulated by the FDA and drinking water is regulated by the EPA. And the regulation is much, much, much more stringent for tap water than it is for bottled water. And in fact, if bottled water doesn't cross state lines, then it's regulated by the state, which means, frankly, it's usually unregulated. And so if you're drinking, this is one message for everyone. Your utility is doing well. Unless you have reason to think that there's a problem with your utility, you should drink your tap water. They send out these reports. These are hardworking public servants. If you're drinking bottled water because you think it's cool, because it's convenient, that's fine. But unless you have a reason to doubt your utility, drinking bottled water for safety is I think a waste of money. Sorry, I got on a rant. What was that? What was that?
The first thing is privatization going to make the individual need
Oh,
for drinking
yeah.
water
Yeah.
your
So
social
this,
problem?
so this, privatization really sets people off. Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren have introduced legislation that essentially would ban privatization of water sources. It's a complicated question, and the data is pretty mixed. Um, as I said before, the problem with public utilities is there's underfunding. One of the arguments for privatization is they can basically have access to capital. And yes, they raise the rates. But the key question becomes, when they raise the rates, is the extra money they're coming in being used to basically revitalize the infrastructure, or is it going out as dividends?
Right.
And that's I think, the fundamental question. There are good examples of privatization that have worked well. Buenos Aires is a good example. There are also some disaster stories. And so, I think this notion, privatization bad, kind of misses the point. There are different kinds of privatization. And just a study that was done by some folks at University of Indiana, Bloomington, they looked at wastewater treatment plants, but it's a similar kind of thing. No, I'm sorry, that's not right. They looked at water treatment plants, and they found that those that were the public water treatment plants were more likely to be out of compliance than private water treatment plants. So just because it's public, there are reasons to like that, but don't assume because it's private, it's necessarily sort of venal greed. It may be, but you've got to ask some additional questions before you can really answer that.
Thank you. Morgan had his actual hand up, so I'm alternating between chat
All right,
questions.
Morgan's going analog.
Yeah. Where did he go?
You're muted, I think, Morgan.
Morgan?
I see Morgan, but looks like we can't hear you for some reason, even though you're muted. So there might be a mic.
Issue. Okay. Well, I'll read some more questions. Let's see. Um,
The Native American I can talk about. That's an interesting story. So there's a question about public drinking water on
oh
Native
yeah.
American reservations. So if you look, there was a study that was done, I think about 3 years ago, on access to drinking water, to treated drinking water. And it turns out about 2.5 million Americans do not have access to treated drinking water, which is less than 1% of the population, but that's a lot of people. And it turns out that there are three large groups. One group is the homeless. One group is Puerto Ricans because a study was done right after a massive hurricane. So that's not really, the right test. The third is Native Americans. And one example in this report was the Navajo Nation. And they're sort of it's doubly tragic because not only are they relying on well water, but it's contaminated because a lot of the mining that was done that basically led to contamination. And as I said earlier, to understand drinking water, you've got to understand infrastructure. And for much of our nation's history, infrastructure dollars did not go to reservations. I have to give the Biden administration credit. They've really been focusing on this issue, but the reservations are way behind in terms of the treatment plants and the piping to get it to people. And so whoever asked that question, they're absolutely right. If you're looking for large groups of sort of identifiable Americans, Native Americans, particularly in the Southwest, are at much greater risk of drinking water problems than other groups of Americans, and it's a problem.
Thank you. Next question is there any form of protection that you think would be effective to allow humans to keep access to drinking water? Would differences in need also be included? I think you addressed some of this in the sort of.
Yeah, let me change the focus from the US to the global South, because the fact is that's where drinking water is an issue in the US, but to be perfectly honest, our health is much more affected by what we eat than our drinking water. By and large, our drinking water actually is quite clean and safe. That's not the case in a lot of parts of the world. Many of you, I'm sure, have traveled. And you have to be careful where you drink the water. I mean, when I give these talks, I basically say, take your assumptions about drinking water and turn them completely on their head, right? I don't care. I don't think at all really about the quantity of drinking water, of water that comes out of my tap, right? Basically, I flush my toilet with drinking water. I fill my radiator with drinking water. I don't think about the quality. I trust my utility to get it right. And it's not my responsibility. If there's a problem, I call up the local utility. None of those is true in much of the world. So these numbers are rough, but about 2.5 billion people do not have regular access to treated drinking water. A study was done a few years ago that found that about half of the global South population suffers at some point in their life from a serious waterborne disease. If you just think about human productivity, that has enormous impact. And there's another feature as well, which is that again, for well over 1 billion people, the water is not delivered to where they are. They have to gather the water. And when I say they, that's inaccurate. It's women in general who have to gather the water. And even that's inaccurate. Usually it's girls. And so when you talk to development economists and you say, what's the quickest way to improve the quality of life, the economic productivity of a community, they will tell you to a person, ensure safe drinking water, because essentially you're freeing up the labor of almost half the population. And there's photos when I give my talks with PowerPoint, there are all these photos I have of these women and girls waiting, for the water truck to come, waiting at a well. And so, one of the big questions is, so how should we do this? And there are a few different theories, and it's very interesting right now in the development community how this is playing out. There's a real battle going on about the right approach. And I'm oversimplifying, but essentially the approach is kind of gray infrastructure, which is build the treatment plants, build the piping system. That's quite expensive. And for these smaller rural communities, it's really not affordable. And you've got these big problems of upkeep, right? So maintenance and parts is a huge challenge for these issues. And so another approach that's been getting a lot of traction is called POU, which stands for point of use. And the idea basically is assume the water somehow gets contaminated between where it is originally and where it ends up with the people who are using it. And the argument is you can have very cheap sachets of chlorine or putting it out in the sun in a way that UV rays purify it, or different kinds of filters that are very inexpensive. And there's a real battle going on in the development community which to fund. And one of the difficulties with POU, which has had a lot of success at the local scale, is it's not how these development agencies are used to operating. They're used to operating with these capital projects. And so, basically getting people on the ground to train people, to get them to change their practice to POU is just a different way of thinking about development. So that the answer to your question would be there's a lot of interest in this, as you can imagine. But the way the approach should be is quite contested.
Interesting. Um, The last question so far is one from Morgan, asking you to talk about the role of the Safe Drinking Water Act as opposed to the Clean Water Act. And you can see the question, the way
Yeah,
it can turn into a strictly public health mechanism, into an environmental protection mechanism.
yeah.
Any thoughts about that?
And Morgan, if you had your hand for a different question, feel free to type that in as well. If this,
Can you hear me?
I can
Oh,
hear you.
yeah, we can hear
He can
you.
talk.
Okay.
He can
No,
talk.
actually, the only reason I raised my hand was like because you were telling the Ohio story, and I used this case in my policy class actually next week. And my favorite / least favorite thing about that is what the state legislature did in response. There are two
Yes.
bills. Basically, the effect was to immunize farmers from civil damages. Basically, they packed like the clean, the let's fix Toledo's water bills. But the sort of pointy end of these bills was basically to say farmers are immune from any claims of damages. So to protect the farmers, and it told you so much about how water mediates a relationship between cities and rural areas where there's race at play, and these are agricultural states like Wisconsin.
Yeah, so what Morgan's talking about are called right to farm laws.
Yeah.
And a lot of ag states have them. I don't know if Wisconsin has one or not. I wouldn't
Yeah.
be surprised. It
We
does?
do.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So in addition to the right to farm law, they did something else, Morgan. They passed a law that basically said that you could not give rights to nature,
Yeah.
Wow.
just as a statutory fiat. Even though the provision had been struck down by a court. So let me talk a little bit about sort of the Safe Drinking Water Act, SIDWA, and the Clean Water Act. So Safe Drinking Water Act is passed in 1974. It was Gerald Ford's first law upon becoming president. Nixon had refused to sign it because he didn't like how it was funded. Clean Water Act was passed in 1972. Clean Water Act expressly did not address drinking water. All right, so Clean Water Act basically addresses discharges into so-called navigable waters. So imagine kind of a Dickensian plant just belching this sort of effluent. That's the kind of typical thing. As I mentioned before, most, not all, but most ag operations were specifically excluded from the Clean Water Act. One of the big questions with the Safe Drinking Water Act is what should the regulatory powers be? And so SIDWA focuses almost exclusively on two things, and arguably it should have been three things. First thing is on the water that's coming from the treatment plant. And so they're basically what are called maximum contaminant levels that are basically standards. PFAS, Steph was talking about earlier, there was one just issued recently for PFAS. There are about 100 of these. And what you'd expect, arsenic, PFAS, bacteria, those kinds of things. That's where most of SIDWA focuses. Second focus of SIDWA is on what's underground injection, called underground injection control. So basically, if there's a lot of about 40% of the cities around the US depend to some extent on groundwater for their drinking water. And so SIDWA requires permitting if you're going to inject fluids that might affect an aquifer that's used for drinking water, except for fracking. Why not fracking, which obviously can and has contaminated drinking water supplies? Because in 2005, there was something called the Halliburton loophole, which was added to the Energy Security Act of 2005. It was lobbied for by the vice president, a certain Dick Cheney, who had worked for Halliburton. And so fracking is exempted from federal control. What SIDWA doesn't cover, and what Morgan's question I think is getting at, is watershed protection. The original version of the Safe Drinking Water Act, which interestingly was named the Pure Drinking Water Act. And there's an interesting discussion I can have if you want about why it changed from Pure Drinking Water Act to Safe Drinking Water Act. But it would have given them the power to basically control watersheds, which essentially is land use. And land use is fundamentally a local government authority. It's why wetlands regulations on the Clean Water Act are so controversial. The feds it seemed the feds should not have control over local land uses. So EPA was not given that authority. There was one exception that came out in amendments to SIDWA, which basically said that required that if you were a city that got above a certain size that got your water from surface water, you had to pre-treat it unless you could show that you could provide clean drinking water through another method. And what Morgan's question is referring to is New York City took advantage of that. and they basically passed a green bond of about $1.5 billion. New York, I'm from Boston. I'm in Boston now. I hate New Yorkers. I'm sorry, I just do. They're so, we have the best pizza, we have the best baseball, we have the best theater, blah, 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 blah. It makes me want to puke. But they also say we have the best drinking water. And that's actually true. New York tap water routinely beats drinking water beats bottled water, beats all kinds of tap water. The reason is that it doesn't come from New York City. It comes from about 120 miles away in the Catskill and Delaware watershed, and it's piped down. And the problem with the 1980s, the quality of that water started to deteriorate as more of that area got developed. So basically what New York City did is it paid to do all kinds of land treatments and paying landowners to change how they use their land to reduce the salting, to reduce the septic systems, put in sewer systems, all kinds of things to buy buffer lands. And the way it's described is they invested in green infrastructure, so the ecosystem service of water purification, instead of gray infrastructure, which would have been about a $3 billion, $5 billion treatment plant. A few cities have done that. But the fact is, and this is the key thing, Clean Water Act only indirectly helps you with drinking water because it makes sure the water that you are treating is not super polluted. Safe Drinking Water Act does what it can, but it really has one hand tied behind its back because it doesn't really have source water protection.
Thank
Morgan,
you.
I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my story. I'm sticking with it.
Um, the last question that's up, and if anyone wants to add any more questions, that's great. Otherwise, I also have one. But before the Gaza-Israel war, it was commonly believed that the next war in the Middle East would come over water. Could you talk about that and, between which countries?
Yeah, and in fact, you could, I mean, forget the Middle East, which is complicated enough. You could have talked about India, Pakistan. You could have talked about the Mekong. There are water disputes, some water wars arguably happening all over the world. And this is amped up because of climate change. And the fact is that water flow, I mean, there's still the same amount of water on Earth. That's not going to change. But climate change is dramatically changing how much water falls, when it falls, and where it falls. And so as a result, some areas are facing drought that they never really thought to face. I mean, Cape Town had this thing called Day Zero, which sounds like a bad garage band. And what it was referring to was this particular day where they were going to have to turn off taps because they ran out of water. Barcelona had to bring in tanker water from Marseille. Phoenix and Atlanta may have a reckoning coming as well. So these are all very real issues. There was a there was a #1 TV series in Canada about when I was writing the book about 15 years ago, 20 years ago now, that involved the U.S. the plot was the U.S. invades Canada to control the Great Lakes. And we might think that's preposterous, but it was the #1 show in Canada for a while. So what the person here is asking about is the Golan Heights, which essentially is the top of the watershed. And who controls the Golan controls a lot of water. Israel controls the water going into the Palestinian Authority. That's been a big issue. India, Pakistan, the Kashmir has long been a area of dispute. One reason is that it's the top of the watershed. China and the Mekong. There are a lot of concerns that Chinese dams are controlling and reducing the amount of water flow through the Mekong. And so this upstream, downstream dynamic is becoming increasingly important. In fact, right now, Egypt has threatened to go to war. They've moved troops to the border. This happened 2 weeks ago, threatening Sudan and Ethiopia. Ethiopia finally finished what's called the GER, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which basically dams the Nile way above Egypt. And Egypt's not happy about it. And so this question is right. I mean, it's rare that water is the only reason for conflict, but there's no question it really amps up conflict for sure.
I like that you brought in the North American example because we in Wisconsin are constantly paranoid that Texas is going to take our water.
Yeah.
So this comes up every now and then. Oh no, Texas! But there's a Great Lakes Compact that'll defend us against Texas.
Yeah. So there's a quick story here. Do I have time to tell it or not?
Yeah.
So there was this small Canadian company, and when I mean small, their office was above a pizza parlor in Toronto. And they basically put in a request to fill a tanker, it's about 25 years ago, fill a tanker with water and take it to Saudi Arabia. And word got out and the media just amped this up and people flipped out. And that's why you started getting these billboards saying, keep the suckers out.
Oh,
And
wow.
there's this fear that somehow Texas, California, New Mexico, the evil folks from the Southwest are going to basically take the great water from the Great Lakes. And so the Great Lakes Compact was amended,
Mhm.
and it basically now requires unanimity from all the states and the provinces around the Great Lakes
Yep.
before any diversion of water outside the watershed. And it banned bulk water movement. So two kind of interesting things about this. The first is it says nothing about bottled water.
Right.
And I can promise you a lot more bottled water is leaving the Great Lakes than would happen in tankers. The second thing is that a lot more water than that is taken through irrigation. And so poor Waukesha, so they are, I think, about 12 miles from Lake Michigan. Their drinking water source got contaminated. And so they want to bring in water from the Great Lakes. It took several years before all the states and the provinces would agree to let Waukesha take its water from Lake Michigan, right? There's something about
Yep.
water. It's like it's mine, and it's a very primal kind of thing. How dare you take what's mine?
Yeah, it's starting to come up too with big data centers, and their large amount of water use. So I've been
Yeah.
starting to see some
So
municipalities, like in Virginia, fighting back.
I have a public service announcement. So, uh, AI searches, ChatGPT, some of the others, those take 10 times more energy than a Google search, which means a lot more energy, means a lot more water. And this is tap water. So in some places where these the data centers are using a quarter or more of the municipal water. And it's tap water they're taking because the water has to be treated because it has to be clean. It basically is cooling down those centers. And so, ChatGPT is amazing. It's got a lot of great uses. Please do not get in the habit of using ChatGPT for things you can do a Google search for. You're doing the environment a favor if you use sort of traditional internet searches as much as you can.
Thank you for bringing that up. I actually put that on something like that on my syllabus too. And I think that's it for time.
Yeah,
Well, we have a little bit of time. Let me ask the one more question, which you were talking about sort of safe drinking water and actually how many more ailments are foodborne. But a lot of the foodborne ailments come about because of untreated water, right? So the leafy green outbreaks are pretty much entirely like sort of untreated water, or sometimes pests getting into the area. But a lot of it's just untreated water, which contains
right.
manure from neighboring farms. That interface doesn't really seem to be addressed at all by Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, or any of the food. I mean, they've got some stuff in this Food Safety Modernization Act, but it still doesn't fully get there.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Look, I have great respect for America's farmers. They
Yeah.
provide an incredibly important service. Food security matters a great deal, but their lobbyists have effectively carved out most farm operations from federal control. And what that means, and that's not going to change. And what it means is if there's going to be action, it has to be at the state or county level. Um, and what Steph's talking about is absolutely the case. Some states can do it, right? So California's got some pretty strict laws about this. Other states do as well. It's hard when it seems to be more expensive. But I think the stories you tell the stories and people realize this actually is a real concern. And there are management practices that have been developed over the years that actually make this less onerous. So I think that's actually, it sort of ties together Steph and Morgan's questions. That's, I think, kind of the next frontier for water law is basically trying to address these gaps that were carved out because of political deals and saying enough's enough, right? It's been 52 years since the Clean Water Act, 50 years since the Safe Drinking Water Act. These are problems that we have to address if we care about the safety of our food.
Right.